It's my fault. I didn't have it plugged in. We're in 1 John chapter 4. 1 John chapter 4. Want to remind everyone again, our prayer schedules are out on the tables in the foyer, and that's for the months of September and October, and so you can pick one of those up. 1 John chapter 4. We're looking at, in this section that began in chapter 3, there is a contrast made between the children of God and the children of the devil. And so he went through in the first 3 verses and explained to us what it means to be a child of God, the wonder that comes along with that. And then he goes through this contrast of what the children of God and the children of the devil do, and they're antithetical to one another. And then looking at how we are to love, and he gives a negative example in Cain and the positive example in Jesus. And then he talked to us a little bit about reassurance and assurance, and, well, I guess I should have said assurance and then reassurance. But anyway, I hope you got the point. Assurance and reassurance, and then where we come to in chapter 4, verses 1 through 6, is dealing with discernment. And we talked about how for some people, if you talk about assurance, you talk about certain things in Christianity, they are more bent that way, they lean that way. It's easier for them than for others. But this particular section is incredibly hard for those same people. The same way that the previous section was hard for certain people who are more bent toward a discerning spirit, a belief in sometimes a zealous belief in black and white, right and wrong, and so it's interesting how the Bible challenges both of these notions and kind of pushes us in the direction. And really what we need, what I've come to see through the years, is that we need each other. Whatever our natural disposition is toward, the danger is that we separate from each other and we break off into camps and we just simply refuse to interact with each other and we disrespect one another, and instead of learning from each other. That is, if someone has a gift of being a loving, compassionate, accepting person, if that's not my natural tendency, I need to be around people like that to help me develop that. If I'm not one who is, I find it very hard to see the difference or to say things to people that might be, or just to take stands that might be difficult. I need to be around people who are able to make those stands, to help me, to bring that out in me. And so, as with many things, the diversity of the church is where there's a reason God placed us here, and there's a reason that He gives us such diversity. And that is because we need each other. That push and pull, that tension has to exist. And I don't mean tension in a negative sense, but that tension has to exist. We have to be able to try our best to walk that line in faithfulness, and it takes both. It cannot be an overemphasis on one to the neglect of the other. It has to be both of them coming together. What I love, the song, in one of the phrases in the song, "Give Me the Bible," is law and love combining. Okay? Law and love combining. That kind of deals with those two dispositions. So, we're looking at 4, 1 through 6. So let's read it once again. We're actually going to be in verse 5, the latter portion of it, but let's read it and put it in front of us. He says, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, for many false prophets have gone out into the world. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. And every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, who you have heard was coming and is in the world already. Little children, you are from God, and you have overcome them, for he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world. They are from the world, therefore they speak from the world, and the world listens to them. We are from God. Whoever knows God listens to us. Whoever is not from God does not listen to us. By this we know the spirit of truth and the spirit of error. Okay. So in verse 1, he just makes the assertion that you're not supposed to believe everybody that comes to you and says, what I'm telling you is what God said. Okay? I mean, we have to think through and test that. Okay? And then he gives us two tests. And you have to remember, the two tests that he gives are really context specific. He's not saying with these two tests that these are the only two things you ever need to consider. If someone comes to you and says, I have a message from God, he's not saying these are the only two tests you should ever put them to. But contextually, where you're denying the divinity of Jesus, right? Then these tests need to be inserted, okay? If we're dealing with different issues, we have different tests, we have different criteria, okay? It's not a one-size-fit-all. There's a reason why even in medicine, we have tests that we run to try and look for different things. To try and simply treat and diagnose every disease based upon one particular test isn't going to get you the result you're looking for, okay? So understanding that, but what this does is it gives us the principle of putting things to the test based upon the situation. And so in in verses 2, 3, and 4, the test is this. What do they say about Jesus? What do they say about Jesus? Ask them, is he God's son? Did he come in the flesh? If they do not affirm that, then you're not to listen to them. Okay? Now, the second test where we'll pick up in verse 5 is, who do they listen to and who listens to them? Okay? They are from the world, therefore they speak from the world, and the world listens to them. We are from God, and whoever knows God listens to us. Whoever is not from God does not listen to us, and by this we know the spirit of truth and the spirit of error. So, who listens to them? Is it the people who are spiritually discerned, or is it people who are worldly? You see, we have this, for lack of a better term, there's just a vocabulary, there's an understanding, there's an approach to the world. Or there are multiple approaches, we call them worldviews. But, some people, when they are in certain circles, they either feel comfortable or uncomfortable depending upon their worldview and whether it matches the people who are around them. Okay? So, I don't think it's any secret what my feelings are about a Christian's relationship with alcohol. Okay? I have been around it my whole life. I've seen it. I have spent a great deal of time talking with people who partake in it, trying to understand what they're saying, what is their motivation, what are you doing, why, how, seeking to understand their perspective. But their perspective always falls short of something that I can justify. The way they're coming at it and approaching it is, and this is not true of every individual, but if someone says, well, this is fun, we must be operating on two different definitions of fun. And if I need exterior enhancements to loosen me up or to make me have fun, then look, we're just you see, we're in two different worlds. Okay? We're just in two different worlds. He's not going to see it my way, and I'm not going to see it his way. Doesn't mean you can't respect each other. But We just operate in different, we have different criteria by which we decide if something is right or wrong. We have different criteria, we have different allegiances, we have different motives, we have different purposes in life, we have different, there is a difference. And what John is highlighting in this book is there is a difference between the world and Christians. And so, the reason why, isn't it amazing how you can sit? I've been in plenty of rooms where somebody is up and they're making an argument for something, and everybody's like, yeah. And that's when I just kind of start looking around and go, am I crazy? Because what he's saying doesn't make a lick of sense. He's contradicting himself. His argument isn't holding up. What am I missing? You see, people who are like-minded will buy each other's arguments. They think the same way, and so they fall in line with each other. Okay? And that's true of both sides. One of the tests that we have to learn to walk through is, number one, making sure we understand what the Bible says clearly on a subject. And then testing what somebody is saying based upon what God is revealing. Okay? That's a test. So, who is listening to them? And one of the reasons why people are listening to them is just because they approach life the same way. And the reason why other people are not listening to them is because we're operating with completely different systems. Okay? The best way I know how to say it is, one person is talking PC, Microsoft junk, and we're over here talking Apple and MacBook. Okay? They're just two different things. And making them communicate is nothing but a headache. So, that's one of the things he wants us, he's telling them specifically to pay attention to. Okay? Let's say somebody comes along and they're trying to present a new understanding of something. And I'm not really sure how. I'm not really sure how I feel about it. Understand what I'm saying right now. This is not the only metric, but it is a metric that registers on my radar. I want to see who they can convince. Are there people who are known to be trustworthy, faithful, solid in their reasoning? Is that the type of person that's buying what's being said? Or is it the type of person who doesn't know the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament? What is the quality of the individual that is being convinced? Okay? That's something that's going to be important to me. Not that that's the sole basis by which I make the judgment. But is it a spiritually mature person or is it an spiritually immature person? And surely we can see the difference between who's being convinced, and that should tell us something. A spiritually immature person is someone that you could convince, honestly, you could convince them of almost anything. The spiritually mature person is the one, they're going to be a little harder sell. It's not that they're inherently disagreeing, they're just going to want to know, okay, if that is true, then what does that mean for this, and what does it mean for this, and what does it mean for this passage and for that passage, and what are the implications of how it is lived out? The immature person just simply says, yeah, it sounds good. saying I have $1 million sounds good. It's not true, but it sounds good. So that's one of the one of the tests that he's putting on this situation. Okay? Is the apostle, for an example, in this context, is the apostle John being sold by what they're saying? You need to be this guy is an apostle. He literally speaks for the Lord. He's an ambassador of God on earth. He's going to be a pretty stinking good metric. If he embraces it, you can pretty much take it to the bank. It's right. Right? He's operating by inspiration. If he doesn't, if it's just all the other people, I don't care how many of them it is, I'm going to stand over here with this inspired apostle. So that's where we have to understand and make differentiations and really, like we said, there are a multitude of tests that we can run, but the point being, don't just take something because somebody says it. And we don't have to be difficult, and we don't have to be condescending, and we don't have to be jerky to simply ask people to prove what they're saying. Okay? And that's what we have to understand. So sometimes what will happen in discussions, especially religious discussions, is that someone will say something. I don't know. Let's just take one discussion. They affirm baptism has nothing to do with your salvation. And then they look at me and say, now prove me I'm wrong. You know what they're doing? They're putting the burden of proof on me. What's the problem with that? I didn't make a claim. The person who makes the claim, the burden of proof rests upon them. People say, you don't disagree? Well, sure I do. But I didn't make the initial claim. The problem is we let people off too easy. If you make a claim that baptism is in zero ways connected to the salvation of the soul, it's your job, it's your responsibility to prove that. It's not my job to disprove it. It's your job to prove it. Now, if I say to you baptism is essential for the salvation of the soul, it's my burden to prove that to you. If I tell you the claim he made is not true, it's my burden to prove that. It's the person who makes the claim. It's their job to prove it. It's not intellectually honest for a person to make a claim and say, now you prove me wrong. That's not how this works. If you're big enough and bold enough to make the claim, then be big enough and bold enough to defend it. And so you see people sometimes can get taken advantage of. And honestly, it's about putting things to the test. And we could spend a long time talking about that, but it's something we need to remember, okay? And it's not just talking about other people. I've heard a lot of Christians say a lot of things in Bible classes and in personal conversations and just a ton of different scenarios. I've heard them make a lot of statements. I have heard very little supporting evidence. And for me, that is a very problematic thing. We don't get to just say, I believe something is true. And why? Well, just because it's kind of out here floating, and I think that's it. This goes back to what we talked about a couple of Sunday nights ago about modern and traditional and Christian identities. Truth is something that exists outside of us, that is tangible. As a matter of fact, Christianity makes the claim that truth is not just a set of ideas, it's actually a person. It's Jesus. And so, if I believe it to be true, I can't just say, well, it's true because it's true. 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 What is that? Ain't nothing but a big old circle. That's all it is. And so, whatever it is, I can at least respect the person who makes the claim and then biblically lays out how they get from point A to point B. I struggle with the person who makes a claim and then just says, well, doesn't, that's not an answer. And so what we're dealing with is just quite simple. And something we ought to do more of, which is critical thinking. I forget who it was, somebody here, and I don't remember who it was. Somebody at some point brought me, they brought and showed me a report card of one of their parents. They went to a school somewhere, locally, years ago, and one of the courses that you were required to take was critical thinking. That was one of the courses, critical thinking. And so I'm going to try not to go on a tangent, and some people may be thinking too late, but sorry. This is an issue we've got to address. We live in an information age, which I am all for. I love having literally millions of resources at my fingertips. I like that. The problem is that we have developed as a culture a group of people who broadly know about a lot of different things broadly, because we can Google it. Depth, we're about as deep as a teaspoon. We know a lot in breadth. We know very little in depth. Well, I read it somewhere, or I heard it somewhere. Okay? Now talk to me about your source. Who is it? What are their qualifications? I'm not saying that makes them right or wrong. I'm saying, there's a very real difference. And one of the things with self-publishing, anybody can write a book now. Anybody. And I will say this, there is a difference between even going into a place like Barnes & Noble or Books A Million or any other bookstore you want to go to. There's a difference in stepping into those bookstores and stepping into real bookstores. When you're in a Barnes & Noble and when you're in a Books A Million, you're dealing with books that have been published. There are certain criteria, there are certain ideas there are certain criterias. But it's not rigorous. you want to get into the rigor of something. That is, you will not publish this book. It's not about the publisher making money. It's about furthering the discussion of the issue. Then you got to be qualified. And before you can publish it, you've got to run that thing through the mill, which means other people who know exactly what you do and more, they're going to go after it with everything they've got and see if it will hold up. And after doing that, after going literally through years of critical examination, then it is put forth. That's tested information. Does it make it right? But surely we can see a difference between that and me just self-publishing some book I wrote. Just because we hear it, see it, read it, doesn't make it true. We have to critically evaluate it. So, test spirits. All right. That will then conclude that section. That's not just, so when it comes to being children of God, some people, and we're going to move into a section now that talks about love. That's going to be the whole discussion of 4:7 through 5:5. For some people, Christianity is something where when you walk into a church building, for them, it's you leave your brain at the door. You leave your brain at the door. It's supposed to be an emotional experience. What you thinking, logic, reason, any of those things need to be left at the door. That's the way a lot of people approach Christianity. I'm not anti-emotion. I'm not anti any of those things. But the Bible never once asks you or me to leave our head at the door. It encourages us to bring that head, our brains, in here and to engage it, to feel it, to challenge it, to think with it, to focus with it. That's what God is calling us to. It's not, being a Christian is not just being sentimental. You can't, listen, but at the same time, if you go the other way and say, leave all your sentiment outside, don't just bring your logic and your thinking in here, we're nothing more than a bunch of robots. You got to have them both. And that's why John, as he illustrates and as he talks about what the children of God are versus the children of the devil, as he illustrates the children of God, he harps on ethics, compassion, and thinking. Ethics, the way that we live, our compassion, the way that we love, and the way that we think. Because they're all wrapped up together. So, that then leads to this next section from 4:7 through 5:5, where he focuses in and he talks about love. Now, he has talked about love in two other sections briefly. Okay? He talked about it in chapter 2, verses 9 through 11, which really the emphasis, just the wording of the text, is more on not hating than it is loving. Okay? The second section is in chapter 3, verse 16, and then 17 and 18 deal with the implications of it. But of Jesus, God loving us, and Jesus laying down his life for us, and thus we should lay down our lives for each other. And so he has talked about these two principles. But what we're fixing to get into is where he gives us the motive behind all of that. Why do we love? Okay? And so this is going to be a prime example of you can't even have love without a head. You got to think. Loving is not the absence of thinking. As a matter of fact, learning to love people is something just that you have to learn. There's information that must come into your mind that you must wrestle with and then go through the long process of letting that change of thinking result in the way that you feel and react. So we won't read the whole section right now. We'll read verses 7 through 12. He says, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. In this, the love of God was made manifest among us, and God sent His only Son into the world so that we might live through Him. In this is love, not that we loved God, but that He loved us and sent His Son to be the propitiation for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God. If we love one another and God abides in us and His love is perfected in us." So, we begin with the phrase, beloved, of course, the tender affection that is felt between John and these churches. Let us love one another. Now, it's not as clear in English. You could get there, but it's not as clear as it is in its original form. So you could read that to say, let us love one another. This is a command. And you would be right. The Bible commands us to love, and even later in this text, it's going to be in an imperative, love one another. But this is actually written in what is called the subjunctive. Okay? Now, that's not the part I want you to remember. The subjunctive in Greek language is the realm of the theoretical, the realm of possibility. Okay? So, for an example, this is, let us love one another. Here we are on the outside. Let us love one another. What he's saying is, let us move ourselves from the outside of love to those who practice and live in this theoretical understanding, this theoretical world of loving. So move. It's a way of encouraging people. Okay. So this is who you are. This is who I want you to be. I want you to take a step up into this world. Okay. So when he tells us, let us love one another, what he's saying is he's encouraging the group of people to say, we need to be people who love each other. He's not denying that they did not love each other. He's simply saying, whatever it is, we need to take a step up. And we need to make sure that we love one another. Okay? And then he gives the reason for it. For love is from God. Okay? For love is from God. God is the source of love. And then he gives a positive and negative assessment of it. He says, whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Okay? Whoever loves has been born of God, they're a Christian, and knows God. They're continually walking in a faithful relationship with Him. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. I want to read you this statement. I'm sure we'll come back to it next week, but I want to read it here. And that is, the writer says this, John is carefully defining the character of who God is and what it means to live in relation to Him. To genuinely contemplate the true identity of God is to become like Him. A true apprehension of the personhood of God should lead us to change how we live and behave. A true understanding of God is not just cerebral. It's not just about believing the right things about God. It's about believing those right things that work their way into us and conform us to His image. So when Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 18, we all, with an unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed from one degree of glory to another. That is, as we behold and as we consider and contemplate who Jesus is, and we learn how He thinks, we learn how He operates, we see Him on the pages of Scripture, we begin to take on that character. We begin to be changed. We begin to reflect what we see. This is why, for an example, in Hebrews 12, it would say something like, looking to Jesus, staring at Him, transforming, enduring. So I think about it in these terms. One of the things I'm trying to teach my children is to be loving people. Now, rarely have we ever sat down and I've gone into some kind of a theological discussion with them about loving people. And you know what? If those boys grow up and they become unloving people, one of the questions I'm going to ask myself is what? What didn't I show them? Teaching them to love people is much bigger than just saying it. It's actually letting them see me be a person of love who loves them, who loves their mother, who loves people in the church, who loves people in the world. I'm hoping that by them looking at a flawed example, that they can learn and imbibe and embody what loving is. And if I'm hoping that at a sinful man's corrupt level, surely that's what God is expecting from us. He's loving us. And as we watch Him love us, as we watch Him love people, that we slowly take on the nature of who He is. And so that, one of the, I've heard it said by one of my favorite preachers who's now in his early 70s, that he said, some people as they get older, they notoriously get tougher and gruffer. He said in Christianity that just simply can't be true. Because to become more like Jesus is to become more tender and more compassionate and more understanding. To be older should be to look more like Jesus, not less like Him. And that's going to be the foundation of everything we love. And we'll get to this, and I know we're out of time. People say, how do I love someone who hates me? You're going to need your head, and you're going to need to study and consider how God loves you. And that will teach you how to love people who hate you. And so we'll deal with some of the practical aspects of that, hopefully next week.